welcome to the Only You podcast. Simple talk about complex topics in psychiatry and mental health. I'm Lauro Amezcua-Patino. I am a psychiatric nurse practitioner with a doctorate in nursing. We're here today with our resident doctor, Dr. Lauro Amezcua-Patino. He is my father. He is a board-certified psychiatrist, specializing in adult forensic and adolescent psychiatry. Today, we're going to tackle some pretty complex mental health topics, but we're going to break them down and kind of see how we do. So today, we're going to talk about a pretty interesting topic. I think so anyway. ADD, attention deficit disorder, and ADHD. Let's see. What do you think about that?
Well, welcome. Thank you for being here again. Well, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is the new way of calling it. Mm-hmm. Back in the old days, we used to call them ADD or ADHD, and a lot of people still think of it that way.
Mm-hmm. Is there a difference? Is there...
Well, in the old days, before this new way of calling it, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, with three subtypes, primarily inattentive, combined, primarily hyperactive impulsive. So when you look at attention deficit now, there's basically three types when we used to think of two types. One is the people who only had attention deficit, and the people who had attention deficit and was also hyperactive. So those are just technical issues. They don't really change what attention deficit is all about, right? And there's certain things that I think that people in general needs to understand, and that attention deficit is not something you acquire most of the time. And we can talk about acquired forms of that, which are kind of rare. But in general, as a disorder, as an illness, attention deficit disorder is something you're born with. Mm-hmm. And it is kind of simple because it has to do with how your brain connections are working. For some reason, we don't know exactly, but it might be your background, inheritance, genetics from your family. It could be things that happen when your brain is forming, right? Exposure to substances like drugs and alcohol or medications while the baby is developing. Whatever the reason, the baby comes out, okay, with problems. And the problems have to do with two major areas. One is not being able to pay attention, and the other one is like not having breaks in the brain, so they just don't stop, right?
Like the connections.
No, the behavior. I mean, basically, if you want to think of a kid who's hyperactive, think about a car without brakes. He just starts running and he just won't stop, right? So, and they do that many times, and then if they have also inattention, then they're hyperactive and moving all the time, and then they don't pay attention. So you can, if you really think about it, it's pretty disabling I mean, in terms of learning, in terms of relationships with other people, and so on. So how do you know, I mean, from your point of view, how do you know somebody has attention deficit disorder?
I mean, the hyperactivity part is it's easy to spot, especially in kids. You know, they're the loud, crazy, difficult kid to manage in a classroom. So they're easy to spot. The inattentive kids are difficult, but they're usually the daydreamers. They're the, just la la, but they can also be very shy, quiet, don't tend to do well. Their grades are sometimes low, but they aren't necessarily that easy to spot. Sometimes, in my opinion, ADD that's inattentive type goes unnoticed for a very long time. Do you agree?
Yeah, I agree. I think it goes unnoticed until it doesn't, right? Mm-hmm. Until things start getting too complicated or too complex that it starts to show. So in terms of symptoms, is not just that the kid's not paying attention. It is also that the kid is having trouble learning. It's also that the kid procrastinates a lot, right? Because their mind is somewhere else. Inattentive kids have the ability to hyper focus. So, for example, especially nowadays with electronics, right? iPads, iPhones, tablets, all those different things. You give them one of those things, and they can actually hyper focus on it at the expense of everything else.
Mm-hmm.
So they're focusing on that, and then you call them, you call their names, they don't answer to you.
Mm-mm.
And not only that, if you take that tablet away from them suddenly, they'll throw you a big tantrum, right? Because not only you are taking away the hyper focus, you're forcing them to focus into something else, and that's very confusing for them. So we're not going to talk yet about how to handle those things, but in general, procrastination, inability to do homework,
Complete normal home tasks.
exactly. So they overwhelm their parents. Okay, I mean they really put a lot of pressure on the family structure because they have a lot of difficulty following rules. And one of the main issues with inattentive kids is that their behavior starts to become problematic.
One of the things is I think parents compensate for a lot for those kids, and they also will, that's also I think how they get missed. A lot of parents will do things for those kids for a long time. You know, did they brush their teeth? Well, we set out their toothbrush every day until they're 25. Okay. Do they wash their clothes? Do they do the dishes? Do they clean? No, we do all of that for them.
Well, I do agree. I think that there's a lot of compensating the parents do. I think that there's some compensating the parents end up doing out of frustration.
Correct.
Because if they don't, then
it never
happens. So, because it's not just the procrastination and the inattentiveness. They're not very good at doing any planning, right? Everything is impulsive and reactive. So they want things here and now, and whatever happened 5 minutes ago didn't happen. It's gone. It's part of history.
I had a really interesting conversation with a dad of an inattentive child because he was asking, you know, well, what was ADD not a thing when I was little? And I said, well, no, but things have. I said, yes, of course it was, but you learn coping mechanisms to where, you know, you likely developed strategies to deal with your ADD. Because I said, did you ever do this? Did you ever do that? And he was like, that's me. That's how I was as a kid. But now I know to leave my keys in the exact same spot every day. I know I have to do certain things or there are consequences to, you know. And he described that he was an inattentive kid, but his parents would, you know, do certain things if he didn't do a routine, but he remembers in his head knowing that there were certain consequences. Do you think that the way parenting is now, it's a little bit, you know, because he was arguing with me about that. I said, oh, well, I don't know.
You get him into a pretty slippery slope here.
I know, but I had this conversation with the parent and I was like, I don't know.
What is complicated is that you and I belong to different generations. So sometimes when I start talking about things that happened 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, I sound like an old man who's saying that the past was better than the present, right?
But I mean, he had a point. I mean, he said, well, if I didn't do these things, my parents would X, Y, and Z. And I said, well, that's true. But I mean, he had a point. Yeah, he was disciplined very, very differently than he disciplined his own child. And I'm medicating his child. And he was not medicated.
I'm very critical of helicopter parenting, right? In terms of you do everything for your child, you overprotect your child. So if you look at generational differences between today and the 1960s, 70s, there's something to be said about the ability to play in open spaces, right? Kids don't do that very much. I mean, even if your kid goes to play soccer, it's within certain structure.
Yeah.
Right? It's not like the kids can go on the street, you know, and the parents would be watching what they're doing all the time.
No.
I mean, there was a lot of opportunity for mischief when I grew up.
Yeah.
Right? Because I was told, get out.
Yeah.
I don't want you here, you know, and the TV had 3 channels, right? And one of the TVs was black and white.
Wow.
So it was so it was kind of boring.
Yeah.
So you had to be outside, right?
Yeah.
The outdoors are very helpful for kids with attention deficit disorder because it allows them to start changing their focus quite a bit. I mean, there's some theories about genetics. Why do we have attention deficit disorder genetically? There's 2 possibilities. One is that it was something happened genetically and our genes got damaged. The other one is that attention deficit disorder is adaptive, or it was adaptive in certain point of our development, right?
Correct.
So, for example, if you were a caveman, right, and you were a member of a tribe, and you had to go hunting and leave the tribe and go and find something to eat for the rest of the people, you needed certain features in your being, right? You had to be aggressive. You had to be someone who doesn't create very strong emotional attachments to people, didn't care if it was coming back or not, right? And you had to have the ability to hyper-focus.
ADD.
Exactly. So if we believe that as a theory, right, then there's something adaptive to attention deficit disorder. I think that we should be teaching attention deficit disorder kids under a tree. On the outside, and instead of a classroom, you put these hunters in a box, and they go crazy.
Yeah, it's
Right?
true.
They don't function well. Okay, so the problem is that today we don't need hunters as much as we did 3,000 years ago, right? So their adaptiveness doesn't fit with the environment they're in now, right? Now, that creates problems because they still have that energy, they still have that hyper-focus, and they still like breaks.
Yeah.
So in the environment today, it's going to create situations where their behavior is going to be construed or identified as abnormal, as violent, as defiant, as oppositional. We actually have a diagnosis for that.
Yes.
Called oppositional defiant disorder that comes hand in hand with a lot of the boys with attention deficit. So we're not doing enough adaptiveness for them, right? So now
we require them to adapt to us.
Exactly. So the idea of what happened 40 years ago versus today is that we have become a lot more restrictive and boxy, right? We put people in boxes.
Yeah.
So you don't let them go outside by themselves. It's too dangerous, right? I mean, I was surprised the other day that a kid was walking in school. It was a 10-year-old with a 7-year-old. They were both walking to school.
Alone?
Alone. And DCS was called.
What?
And the mother was arrested.
Oh, no.
Can you believe that?
Probably, yeah, I believe it.
Yeah. How is that possible?
Well, dangerous.
Because, exactly.
Very dangerous.
We bought into the idea that the world is a dangerous place and that our kids have to be under our watch all the time. That prevents growth, right? Hence, kids are staying in their home till they're like 35 years old.
Yeah.
Right?
And their parents do everything for them.
Yeah. So there's no drive toward what we genetically made for, which is independence, right? So we have a lot of issues there. But back to the attention deficit population, if you actually spend time with these kids, and you do because you treat them all the time, you know that there's another part of them, right? That they have empathy, that they have the ability to relate to people. You just have to give them the environment where they can grow, right? Now, here's the other part that is problematic. Probably, I would say 70% of if you see a kid with attention deficit disorder, and we always bring the parents with them, If you bring both parents, you're going to find out in about 70% of the cases, one of the parents also has attention deficit.
Oh, of course. I would say like 99%. You know which parent has it.
Exactly.
They came from them.
Yeah, right, exactly. So imagine a parent with attention deficit disorder trying to raise a kid with attention deficit
It's
disorder.
impossible.
So
It's
that is problematic. The other part is that sometimes we get confused between having attention deficit disorder and not being smart.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And actually, you were talking before about the inattentive kids. Okay? Very often, inattentive kids are very smart.
Oh, yeah.
And what happens is that they get bored in school.
Mm-hmm.
They get it. They know it. They don't want to be listening to the teacher anymore. They don't want to see what they're doing. They want to get out of there.
Mm-hmm.
They want to go play. They want to go to the outside. Right? And they start getting impatient as they're getting rowdy, or they start playing with the guy next door.
Mm-hmm.
So it is important to recognize that if we are to be individual in how we treat these patients, that we need to recognize the needs. So in those particular cases, it's important to do, there's where you have to do some testing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where you have to actually measure their inattentiveness, you have to measure their hyperactivity, you have to measure with their academic skills. I mean, we do testing with these kids all the time. I mean, I've seen kids who are definitely inattentive, and they're in the 6th grade, and they're scoring at 12th grade stuff on vocabulary, math, spelling. I said, how is that possible?
And they've never finished a class.
They never finished a class. Yeah. And they're failing because they don't do homework.
They don't turn stuff in.
But they're very smart.
Yeah. Oh,
right?
yeah.
So the thing is, okay, so how are we adapting to them instead of just forcing them to adapt to us? So that becomes
and I think a lot of, just back to kids, parents aren't aware that there's resources or things that they can do. When you say adapting, there's individualized education plans and things that we can allow these kids to help them with adapting to their environment at schools and things like that. I mean, these kids are failing because they don't turn homework in, but they're 100% on tests or things like that, or needing extra time on tests. They're just different things, but I think there's still a lot more to talk about with ADD. Well, thank you very much for chatting with me today and for all of your time, and we will see you guys next time.